There is a moment, and you may have already passed through it without fully understanding what it was, when the weight you have been carrying inside your chest begins to shift, not because something was resolved, not because someone finally saw you, or apologized, or changed. It shifts because something inside you stopped reaching. You may not have even noticed it consciously. It may have happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of a conversation you had had 100 times before, when someone in your family, or someone who holds the shape of family in your psyche, said something designed to pull you back into position, and for the first time, your body did not respond the way it always had. There was no argument, there was no door slamming, there was no dramatic refusal or righteous declaration of boundaries. There was just silence, a kind of internal non-movement, as if something deep in the architecture of your nervous system simply declined the invitation, and in that silence, something enormous began. You may not have language for what followed. Most people do not. What follows the moment of emotional withdrawal, true withdrawal, not the reactive kind, not the punishment kind, but the deep and almost involuntary pulling back of a self that has been extended outward for decades, is not peace. It is not relief. It is a strange, disorienting vacancy, a feeling of having stepped out of a role you did not know you were playing and standing now in an empty corridor, unsure whether you are free or simply lost. And this is where most people panic. This is where most people reach back for the familiar ache, the known weight, because at least that weight had a shape, and at least inside that shape, you knew who you were. You were the one who felt. You were the one who held. You were the one who noticed what no one else noticed and carried what no one else was willing to carry. And now, without that function, the question begins to press from the inside: if I am not the one who carries, then who am I? That question is not philosophical. It is structural. It belongs to the deep architecture of what Jung called the complex, not as a clinical abstraction, but as a living pattern woven into your body, your reflexes, your relational instincts from the earliest period of your life, before you had words, before you could name what was happening around you. Your psyche was already reading the emotional weather of your household with extraordinary precision, not because you were gifted, not because you were special, but because your survival depended on it. In homes where the emotional climate is unstable, where a parent's mood determines whether the house is safe or dangerous, where love is conditional upon performance, where silence means disapproval and warmth must be earned, the child does not develop the luxury of self-orientation. The child develops other orientation. The child learns to feel the room before feeling itself. And this is not a flaw. This is a masterful adaptation. This is the psyche doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping you alive inside a system that could not hold your emotional reality without distortion. But the cost of that adaptation is that the self becomes organized around the other. Your inner compass does not point inward, it points toward the parent, toward the caretaker, toward the one whose emotional state determines your experience of safety, and over time, Disorientation becomes invisible. It becomes so deeply embedded in the way you move through the world that you do not experience it as a strategy. You experience it as identity. You say, I am empathic, I am sensitive, I feel things deeply, and all of that may be true. But underneath those descriptions lies a pattern that was not chosen, it was installed. A pattern that says your value is in your capacity to hold what others cannot hold for themselves. This is the unconscious bargain, and it is important to understand it not as a concept but as a lived architecture, because it explains everything that has confused you about your own life. It explains why you are exhausted in relationships that others find easy. It explains why you feel a strange guilt when you are happy, as though your happiness has been stolen from a communal reserve that belongs to someone else. It explains why, in moments of genuine rest, your psyche begins scanning the environment for a crisis to attend to, not because you are anxious by nature, but because your nervous system has been trained to equate stillness with danger. If nothing is wrong, something must be about to go wrong. If no one needs you, you must be failing. The bargain was never spoken. No one sat you down and said your role in this family is to absorb what we cannot process. It was transmitted in 1,000 silent interactions, in the way your mother's face changed when you expressed a need, in the way your father withdrew when you did not perform, in the way the household only stabilized when you became the mediator, the translator, the emotional thermostat. You learned at the level of your cells that love was not given, it was earned, and the currency was self-erasure. You paid with your needs, you paid with your anger, you paid with your truth, and what you received in return was not love. Though it wore the mask of love, what you received was permission to remain. This is the foundation of what Jung described through the lens of the parental complex, the mother complex and the father complex, each shaping the psyche in distinct but interlocking ways. The mother complex does not simply mean your relationship with your mother, it means the entire constellation of emotional associations, bodily responses, unconscious beliefs, and relational templates that formed in the field of the maternal, whatever that maternal presence was. If the mother was emotionally engulfing, the complex tends to produce a psyche that is perpetually merged, unable to distinguish its own feelings from the feelings of others. You do not know where you end and the other begins, because in the original field, there was no boundary. Your mother's sadness was your sadness. Your mother's anxiety was your emergency, and this was not love, it was fusion. But because it was all you knew, you carried it forward as your model of intimacy. Every relationship since then has been shaped by the unconscious expectation that closeness means merging, that love means losing the edges of yourself. If the mother was emotionally absent or unpredictable, the complex takes a different form. You develop a hypervigilant sensitivity, an almost preternatural ability to read micro-expressions, shifts in vocal tone, the precise temperature of a silence, not because you enjoy this kind of awareness, but because you had to develop it in order to predict whether the next moment would bring warmth or withdrawal. And so your empathy, the very quality you have been praised for, the very quality you have built your identity around, is in part a survival instrument, a finely tuned radar system developed in conditions where you could not afford to miss a signal. This does not make it less real, but it changes what it means. It means that your sensitivity is not simply a gift, it is also a wound wearing the shape of a gift. And until you see that clearly, you cannot stop offering yourself to people and systems that consume what you give without ever reciprocating. The father complex operates differently, though it often interlocks with the mother complex in ways that make them difficult to separate. The father, in the Jungian sense, represents the psyche's encounter with structure, with authority, with the external world's expectations. When the father is psychologically absent, not necessarily physically, but emotionally, spiritually, structurally, the child does not develop an internalized sense of its own authority. The child grows up without a model for saying no, without a model for boundaries that are not punitive but simply structural, without a model for standing in a room and taking up space without apology. And so the child, now the adult, moves through the world with a chronic sense of illegitimacy, a feeling that they do not quite have the right to exist on their own terms, that their needs are excessive, that their anger is dangerous, that their refusal will result in abandonment. When the father was present but critical, the complex takes on the quality of an inner judge, a voice inside the psyche that evaluates every action, every word, every feeling against an impossible standard. You may experience this as perfectionism. You may experience it as a constant, low-grade sense of not being enough, but what it actually is, at the structural level, is the internalized father, the imago of a man who could not see you as you were, and so you learned to see yourself through his distorted lens. You are still performing for him, you are still trying to earn what he could not give, and every time you enter a relationship with someone who withholds approval, who offers intermittent warmth, who makes you work for the smallest recognition, you are not choosing that person freely. You are being pulled by the gravitational field of an old complex that is still running beneath the surface of your choices. What happens when both of these complexes are active? When the mother complex has dissolved your boundaries and the father complex has eroded your authority, is a particular kind of psychological position that is almost impossible to see from the inside. You become someone who gives endlessly but cannot receive, someone who senses everything but trusts nothing, least of all yourself, someone who is profoundly attuned to the emotional states of others, but almost entirely disconnected from your own. You know what everyone in the room is feeling. You do not know what you are feeling. And when someone asks you what you need, your first response is not an answer, it is confusion, because need, for you, has always been a signal of failure, a signal that you are asking too much, a signal that you are about to be too heavy for someone who was never strong enough to hold you. And so you learn to need nothing, or rather, you learn to perform needlessness, to make yourself light, accommodating, endlessly flexible while underneath. The unfed parts of your psyche grew louder and louder. Jung would call these unfed parts the shadow, not because they are dark in a moral sense, but because they exist outside the light of your conscious identity. Your shadow contains everything you were not allowed to be: your anger, your selfishness, your hunger, your right to say this is not acceptable, your capacity to walk away without explanation. These are not flaws. These are essential human capacities that were exiled because the system you grew up in could not tolerate them. And so they live underground, pressing against the walls of your controlled, accommodating, emotionally generous persona. And they emerge only in ways you cannot understand, in sudden exhaustion, in unexplained resentment, in the quiet, corrosive feeling that you are disappearing inside your own life. The people around you, the ones who benefited from your emotional labor, do not experience your shadow directly. What they experience is projection. They have projected onto you the role of the container, the healer, the one who holds it together, the one who never breaks. And this projection is not innocent. It is not simply a misunderstanding. It is a psychological convenience, because as long as you carry the emotional weight, they do not have to. As long as you remain the empathic one, the one who feels and processes and absorbs, they are free to remain unconscious, unexamined, psychologically unburdened. Your function in the system is to feel on their behalf, and they will defend that arrangement with remarkable force, not openly, not honestly, but through the subtle mechanisms of guilt, obligation, emotional withdrawal, and the quiet but devastating suggestion that your pulling back is selfish. This is why the moment you begin to stop, the moment you begin to withdraw your emotional labor, the system does not simply adjust, it destabilizes. People who were comfortable begin to feel uncomfortable. People who never mentioned your feelings suddenly become interested in them, not because they care, but because they sense the shift. They sense that the one who was holding it all together is no longer holding, and their response, almost universally, is not curiosity or respect. Their response is pressure. Come back, be who you were. Why are you being so distant? What happened to you? You have changed. And they do not say it like a compliment. They say it like an accusation, because your change threatens the architecture of a system that depends on your self-erasure to function. And here is where the most dangerous moment occurs, because when the system pushes back, when the people who have relied on your emotional labor begin to express distress, confusion, or anger, every old circuit in your psyche lights up. The mother complex says they are suffering because of you. The father complex says you are being selfish. The internalized shame says you are not allowed to have what you are reaching for. And the pull is enormous. The pull to return to the old position, to reabsorb, to soften, to accommodate, to make yourself small again. This pull is not weakness. It is the full gravitational weight of a lifelong pattern, a pattern woven into your identity at the deepest level, a pattern that equates your worth with your capacity to disappear. But something has already changed. And this is the part that is difficult to describe because the change is not dramatic. It is not an epiphany. It is not a breakthrough. It is more like a shift in the ground beneath your feet, subtle, almost imperceptible, but irreversible. You have seen something you cannot unsee. You have felt the difference between giving from fullness and giving from depletion. You have tasted, even briefly, what it feels like to stand in a room without scanning it for someone else's emotional emergency. And that taste, that single fleeting moment of internal quiet has altered the equation, not because you are suddenly healed, not because the complexes are gone, but because the psyche, once it has glimpsed the possibility of its own ground, cannot fully return to the old architecture. Something in you now knows that the weight was never yours, and knowing that even partially, even uncertainly, changes everything about the way the old pattern attempts to reassemble itself. Because it will attempt to reassemble, you should understand this clearly. The complex does not dissolve because you have recognized it. Recognition is the beginning, not the completion. And what makes this phase so treacherous is that the reassembly does not arrive in the form you expect. It does not come as a dramatic collapse back into the old role. It comes quietly. It comes in the form of a thought that seems reasonable, a small accommodation that seems harmless, a phone call you did not want to answer but answered anyway, because the silence afterward would have carried a weight you were not sure you could bear. It comes in the form of a sentence that begins with, "I just want to make sure they are okay," a sentence that sounds like compassion but functions as a doorway back into the architecture you are trying to leave. This is what Jung meant when he described the complex as autonomous. It does not require your permission to activate. It does not wait for you to be ready. It operates beneath the threshold of your conscious will, and it uses the most sophisticated materials available: your love, your loyalty, your genuine care for other people as fuel for its own perpetuation. The mother complex does not say, "Go back because you are weak." It says, "Go back because they need you." The father complex does not say, "You have no right to leave." It says, "A good person would stay." And because these voices use the language of your deepest values: connection, responsibility, love, they are almost impossible to distinguish from your own authentic impulses. This is the cruelty of the complex. It does not speak in a foreign tongue, it speaks in yours. And so the question that begins to surface in this phase, the phase after the initial withdrawal, the phase no one describes to you because most people never reach, it is not whether you should go back. You already know the answer to that, even if you cannot yet say it clearly. The question is something far more disorienting. The question is, if the way I have loved has been shaped by a wound, then what does love actually look like when the wound is no longer running the pattern? And this question does not produce an answer. It produces a void, a genuine emptiness, because you have spent your entire relational life operating inside a system where love and self-betrayal were fused at the root. And now that you are beginning to separate them, You find yourself standing in a space where neither the old model nor the new one has fully formed. You are between structures, between identities, between selves. And the discomfort of that position is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is, in fact, the only honest indication that something has finally begun to go right. Let me describe what this looks like in the texture of ordinary life. Because it is in the ordinary that the complex reveals itself most clearly. You are sitting at a table with someone you love, perhaps a parent, perhaps a sibling, perhaps someone who carries the weight of family in your psyche, even if they are not family by blood. The conversation moves the way it always moves, circling around someone else's problem, someone else's need, someone else's emotional crisis. And you notice something. You notice that your body has already begun to organize itself around the task of holding. Your shoulders have shifted forward slightly. Your breathing has become shallow. You are already composing responses in your mind, soothing responses, bridging responses, responses designed to regulate the other person's emotional state. And this entire process has happened in the space of a few seconds without a single conscious decision. This is the complex in motion. This is the pattern operating at the speed of reflex, faster than thought, faster than choice. And in the past, you would not have noticed any of it. You would have simply done what the pattern demanded, and you would have called it being a good listener. You would have called it empathy. You would have called it love. But now something interrupts. Something sees the mechanism from the outside. Not a dramatic interruption, not a refusal, just a tiny pause, a fraction of a second where you observe the pattern assembling itself. And in that observation, a sliver of space opens between the impulse and the action. You may still do the thing. You may still lean forward and hold and soothe and absorb. But you are no longer doing it from inside the complex. You are watching yourself do it. And that distinction, the distinction between being possessed by a pattern and observing a pattern as it moves through you, is the single most important psychological shift a human being can make. Jung called it the development of the observing ego. It is not detachment. It is not coldness. It is the first moment of genuine freedom. Because for the first time, you are not the pattern. You are the one who sees the pattern. But do not mistake this for mastery. Do not mistake this for completion. Because seeing the pattern does not stop the pattern from running. It simply changes your relationship to it. And this is where a deeper understanding of repetition compulsion becomes essential, not as a clinical concept, but as a lived reality that you carry in your body every day. Freud identified the phenomenon. Jung deepened it. The compulsion to repeat is not simply a failure of learning. It is not that you keep choosing the same kind of person or entering the same kind of dynamic because you are foolish or blind. It is that the psyche is attempting to complete something. It is returning to the scene of the original wound, again and again, in the unconscious hope that this time the outcome will be different. This time, the parent will see you. This time, the withholding one will offer what was withheld. This time, Your love will be enough to transform the person who could not love you in the way you needed. This is not irrationality. This is the logic of the unconscious, and it operates with a ruthless efficiency that your conscious mind cannot override through insight alone. You can know intellectually that you are repeating. You can see the pattern clearly. You can name it, diagram it, write about it in your journal, and you will still find yourself 6 months later sitting across from someone whose emotional signature is almost identical to the one who wounded you, feeling the same desperate pull to earn what should never have been conditional. Because the compulsion does not live in your understanding, it lives in your body. It lives in the way your nervous system responds to a particular kind of silence. The way your chest tightens when someone pulls away, the way approval from a withholding person produces a neurochemical surge that no amount of freely given love can match. You are not addicted to pain. You are addicted to the almost seen, the almost loved, the almost enough, because in the original wound, you came so close, you could feel the possibility of being received, and that proximity, that tantalizing, devastating proximity to what you needed is what the psyche cannot release. The reward for self-betrayal, then, is not pleasure. It is familiarity. It is the particular kind of coherence that comes from occupying a known position in a known system. When you abandon yourself to hold someone else, when you suppress your anger to maintain connection, when you shrink to avoid threatening someone's fragile equilibrium, you feel something that your conscious mind registers as discomfort, but your unconscious mind registers as home. This is the structure you were built inside. This is the emotional climate you learned to breathe in, and leaving it does not feel like liberation. It feels like suffocation, because the air outside the old system is unfamiliar and your lungs do not yet know how to take it in without panic. There is a specific kind of projection that operates in these dynamics, and it must be understood clearly because it is the mechanism by which others unconsciously bind you to your old role. When someone projects onto you the role of the emotional holder, the one who absorbs, processes, regulates, contains, they are not simply seeing you inaccurately, they are depositing something, they are placing inside your psychic space a piece of their own unprocessed material, their anxiety, their grief, their rage, their helplessness, and they are doing it because your structure has always accepted these deposits without complaint. You have been, in the Jungian sense, the vessel, the alchemical container in which other people's raw emotional material is transformed into something bearable. And this is not metaphor. This is what actually happens in the energetic exchange of a relational field where one person is psychologically porous and the other is psychologically defended. The defended one offloads, the porous one absorbs, and both parties experience this as natural, as just the way things are. But it is not natural. It is an arrangement, an unconscious contract, and the moment you begin to withdraw from that contract, the moment you stop absorbing, the projected material has nowhere to go. It falls back onto the person who deposited it, and they feel it, They feel the anxiety they had been outsourcing to you. They feel the grief they had been storing in your chest. They feel the helplessness they had been avoiding by keeping you in the position of the one who manages everything. And they do not understand what is happening. They do not say, I have been projecting my unprocessed emotional material onto you, and now that you have stopped carrying it, I am being forced to feel what I have been avoiding. They say, you have changed. They say you are being cold. They say, I do not know you anymore. And what they mean, beneath all of that, is I need you to go back to carrying what I cannot carry for myself. This is the moment where the old system applies maximum pressure, and it is also the moment where something critical must be understood about shadow attachment, a concept that is rarely discussed with the precision it deserves. When someone has been carrying your shadow, the parts of yourself you have disowned, the emotions you cannot face, the needs you have refused to acknowledge, and they stop carrying it. You do not simply lose a convenience, you lose a psychological structure, you lose the arrangement that allowed you to remain unconscious. And the unconscious does not surrender its arrangements quietly. It fights, it manipulates, it deploys guilt, nostalgia, crisis, illness, whatever is required to restore the equilibrium that kept the unbearable material out of awareness. You have seen this. You may not have had language for it, but you have seen it. You have seen the parent who suddenly becomes ill when you begin to establish independence, the partner who manufactures a crisis the week you start to feel stable, the sibling who resurfaces with an emergency precisely when you have finally created space for yourself. These are not coincidences. They are not evidence of your selfishness. They are the system's immune response. The system, the relational field you were born into, the unconscious contract you signed before you could speak, is fighting to maintain itself. And you are the piece it cannot afford to lose. Because without you in position, the entire architecture becomes visible. Without the one who absorbs, everyone else must face what they have been avoiding, and most people would rather destroy the relationship than face that. So you stand in this peculiar position, you who have spent your life making yourself available, making yourself useful, making yourself indispensable, and you find that your withdrawal, which felt like the smallest possible act, the quietest possible shift, has revealed something enormous. It has revealed that the entire system was organized around your self-erasure, that your position at the center was not a position of power, but a position of function. You were the organ that processed what the body could not process on its own. And now that the organ is pulling back, the body is in crisis, not because you have done something wrong, but because you have stopped doing what was never yours to do. And here is the part that no one tells you, the part that cannot be found in any book about boundaries or healing or self-empowerment. The part that lives in the quiet space between the withdrawal and whatever comes next. When you stop absorbing, you do not simply free yourself from other people's emotional material, you also lose access to the identity that was built around that absorption, the empath identity, the healer identity, the one who understands identity. These were not false identities, they were real. They were built from genuine capacity, genuine perception, genuine care, but they were built on a foundation that was not yours. They were built on the foundation of an unconscious bargain that traded your inner life for your relational position. And when you pull back from the bargain, the identities that were built on top of it begin to lose their coherence. This is experienced not as freedom, but as fragmentation. You do not feel liberated, you feel formless. You reach for yourself and find something unfamiliar, not the organized, capable, emotionally literate, but something raw, less defined, less certain, something that does not yet know how to be in a room without scanning it, something that does not yet know how to love without disappearing, something that sits with its own feelings and finds them strange, almost foreign, because for so long the only feelings you had immediate access to were other people's. This is the threshold. This is the space Jung described as the confrontation with the unconscious, not as a dramatic encounter with a mythological figure, but as the lived experience of standing in the rubble of a psychological structure that can no longer hold. Without yet having built the new one, you are not broken, you are between forms, and the confusion you feel, the emptiness, the disorientation, the strange grief for a self you are not sure you want back, but are not sure you can live without this confusion, is not pathology. It is the psyche doing what it does when it is ready to reorganize at a deeper level. It is the necessary dissolution that precedes genuine integration, but it does not feel necessary. It feels like collapse. It feels like you have made a terrible mistake, and in the middle of it, the old voices return, the mother complex, whispering that you are being cruel, the father complex, whispering that you are being weak, the collective voice whispering that a truly good person would not feel this empty, this uncertain, this unmoored. And you must understand something about these voices, something that will not comfort you, but will orient you. These voices are not lying. They are telling the truth of the old system. Inside the old system, you are being cruel. Inside the old system, you are being weak. Inside the old system, your withdrawal is a betrayal. But the old system was never designed for your survival. It was designed for the survival of the arrangement, and the arrangement required your disappearance. So when the old voices call you cruel for refusing to disappear, they are simply confirming that you are no longer operating inside the structure that demanded your erasure. They are confirming, in their own distorted language, that something has actually shifted, and the shift is not reversible, even when it feels like it should be, even when every cell in your body is screaming to go back, to undo what has been seen, to return to the known suffering rather than stand in this unknown stillness. The shift holds not because you are strong, not because you have mastered anything, but because the psyche, once it has reorganized around a truer perception, cannot fully regress to the old architecture without generating a level of internal friction that is itself unbearable. You have reached the point where going back costs more than going forward. And that is not a motivational statement, that is a structural reality. The energy required to maintain the old role, to resuppress what has surfaced, to reabsorb what you have released, to reperform the version of yourself that the system demands now exceeds the energy required to endure the discomfort of the new position. You are not choosing growth. You are following the path of least psychological resistance, and for the first time in your life, that path does not lead back to self-erasure. It leads forward into something you do not yet have a name for. This is where the quiet phase begins, and it must be described with great care, because everything in the modern psychological vocabulary will attempt to pathologize it. You will be tempted to call it depression. Others will certainly call it that. You may look at your life from the outside and see all the markers, the withdrawal from social engagement, the loss of motivation for tasks that once consumed you, the flatness, the heaviness, the inability to feel excited about things that used to matter, and you will reach for the nearest available explanation. Something is wrong with me. I have gone too far. I have isolated myself. I need to go back, to reconnect, to feel something again. And some of those observations may contain fragments of truth, but the deeper truth, the one that lives beneath the diagnostic categories, is that you are in a phase of psychological reorganization that requires an enormous amount of internal energy, and your psyche is withdrawing that energy from the external world in order to direct it inward. Jung understood this. He lived through it himself during the years he described in the Red Book, a period of profound internal confrontation that looked from the outside like a breakdown, but was in fact the most intensive psychological work of his life. He did not use the language of pathology to describe it, although he recognized that the boundary between creative dissolution and genuine collapse is not always clear. What he understood, and what is essential for you to understand in this moment, is that the psyche has its own economy. It has a finite amount of energy, what he called libido, not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of psychic vitality, life force, the animating current that flows through attention, emotion, desire, and will. And when that energy is being redirected, when it is being pulled from the surface structures of your life and channeled into the deep reconstruction of your inner architecture, the surface goes quiet, not because you are dying, because you are being rebuilt, but the quietness is disorienting precisely because it does not match any model of healing you have been given. The models you have absorbed from culture, from therapy, from the relentless positivity of self-help, all suggest that healing looks like expansion, more energy, more connection, more joy, more capacity, and eventually some of that may come, but the phase you are in right now is not expansion, it is contraction. It is the psyche pulling itself inward, the way a body pulls blood toward its core organs during a crisis, not because the periphery does not matter, but because the core must be stabilized first. And the core, your core, has not been stable for a very long time. Perhaps it has never been stable. Perhaps what you called stability was simply the efficiency of the old pattern, the seamless performance of a self that knew how to function inside a system built on your erasure. That was not stability, that was accommodation. And now that the accommodation has cracked, the real foundation must be laid, and that process does not happen in the light, it happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the space where nothing seems to be happening, but everything is being rearranged. You will notice something during this phase that may frighten you. The people you once felt most connected to, the ones whose emotional states you could read with your eyes closed, the ones whose pain you carried as though it were your own, will begin to feel distant. Not because you have stopped caring, but because the channel through which you received their emotional material is beginning to close, or rather, it is beginning to develop a membrane that was never there before. You will still sense things, you will still notice shifts in tone, in mood, in the unspoken current beneath a conversation. But the sensation will be different. It will arrive with a slight delay, a slight separation, as if you are observing it through glass rather than absorbing it through skin. And this separation, this new and unfamiliar distance between yourself and the emotional field of others, will feel like loss. It will feel like you are losing the very thing that made you who you are. Your sensitivity, your attunement, your capacity to meet another person in the deepest place they inhabit. But what is actually happening is something far more precise than loss. What is happening is differentiation. The capacity you developed in childhood, the capacity to feel what others feel, to absorb their emotional reality, to process it within your own body, that capacity was never bounded. It was never yours in a clean sense. It was merged. Your feeling and their feeling occupied the same space, and you could not tell where one ended and the other began. And that merger was not intimacy, although it felt like it. It was not connection, although you called it that. It was confluence, two rivers flowing into one, with no bank between them. And what is forming now, this membrane, this glass, this subtle new distance, is the bank, the differentiation between your inner life and theirs. And it feels like loss because you have never had it before. You have never experienced your own emotions without the overlay of someone else's. You have never stood inside your own sadness without simultaneously holding someone else's grief. You have never felt your own anger without it being immediately metabolized into understanding, into empathy, into an accommodation that converts your fire into their comfort. So when the membrane forms, when the differentiation begins, you encounter something unexpected. You encounter yourself, not the self you have performed, not the empathic self, the accommodating self, the self that was built to hold, but the self beneath all of that, the one who was never given room to exist because the room was always full of other people's needs. And this self is not what you expected. It is not gentle. It is not soft. It is not the warm, compassionate presence you have been told you are. It is something harder, something with edges, something that contains rage you did not know was there, grief you did not know you were carrying, desires you did not know you had suppressed. And the temptation, the almost overwhelming temptation, is to reject this self, to say, this is not me, this anger is not mine, this hardness is not mine. I am the gentle one. I am the one who understands. I am the one who holds. But that rejection is the final move of the old pattern. That rejection is the complex making its last stand, trying to convince you that the bounded, angry, hungry self is the shadow, the thing to be afraid of, the thing that must be resuppressed for the sake of connection, and you must not listen, not because anger is always righteous or hunger is always clean, but because the self that is emerging, the self with edges, with weight, with the capacity to say no without explanation, is the self you were before the complex took hold. It is the original self, not innocent, not pure, not untouched by life, but real, unborrowed, yours. Jung spoke of this moment with the language of the shadow, not because the emerging self is dark, but because it has been kept in darkness. It has been exiled from consciousness, stored in the basement of your psyche, fed only scraps of indirect expression, a flash of irritation you immediately apologized for, a boundary you set and then retracted within the hour, a fantasy of leaving that you entertained for 30 seconds before guilt collapsed it. These are not symptoms of selfishness. These are the shadow's attempts to communicate through whatever channels remained open. And now, in this quiet phase, the channels are widening. The shadow is no longer whispering through cracks. It is standing in the room with you, and it is asking not to be feared, not to be worshipped, but to be integrated, to be given a seat at the table of your identity, to be acknowledged not as the enemy of your empathy, but as its necessary counterweight, because empathy without boundary is not empathy, it is dissolution, it is the psyche's way of abandoning itself in favor of another and calling that abandonment virtue. True empathy, the kind Jung would recognize, requires two distinct selves. It requires an I that can feel a you without becoming the you. It requires a self that remains standing while witnessing another's collapse, not in coldness, not in detachment, but in the structural integrity of a psyche that knows where it ends. And you have never had that. You have never known where you end. You have been borderless your entire life, and everyone around you benefited from that borderlessness, and they called it your greatest gift. And they were wrong. It was not a gift. It was an absence of the very structure that would have allowed you to give without being consumed. This is what is forming now in the quiet, the structure, not a wall, not a defense, not the reactive hardness of someone who has been hurt and now refuses to feel. Those are compensations. And you know them well. You have seen them in the defended people. You spent your life trying to reach the emotionally armored ones whose walls you pressed yourself against, hoping that your warmth would melt what their own lives could not. No, what is forming in you is not a wall. It is a spine, an internal architecture that holds you upright from the inside, so that you no longer need external validation to know that you exist, so that you no longer need someone else's need of you to feel that you matter, so that you can stand in a room where no one requires your emotional labor and not feel the ground dissolving beneath your feet. The spine is not built from insight. It is not built from understanding. It is built from the accumulated weight of every moment you chose not to go back, every phone call you did not return out of guilt, every conversation you allowed to end without smoothing it over, every silence you sat inside without rushing to fill it with reassurance. These moments, small, ordinary, invisible to anyone observing from the outside, are the material of structural change. They are the psyche laying down new neural pathways, new relational templates, new patterns of response that do not root through the complex, and each one costs something. Each one carries a weight of guilt, a pulse of anxiety, a whispered accusation from the internalized parent that you are failing, that you are abandoning, that you are becoming something cold and unrecognizable, and you sit with that weight. You do not argue with it. You do not try to convince the inner voices that you are right. You simply notice that they are speaking, and you do not obey. This is the mechanism by which power shifts, not power over others. That was never what you wanted, and that is not what is happening here, but power over your own responses, power over the reflexive capitulation that has governed your relational life since before you could speak, the power to feel the pull of the old dynamic and not be moved by it, the power to witness someone's distress without automatically making it your assignment, the power to love someone without that love requiring you to abandon the ground you are standing on. This power does not arrive as a surge. It does not feel electric or triumphant. It feels quiet, almost empty. It feels like standing in a room and not needing anything from it. It feels like hearing a voice that once controlled you and noticing that it has become smaller, not gone, not silenced, but smaller, as though it has been moved to a room farther down the hall, and the people who knew you in the old configuration, the ones who relied on your boundarylessness, who lived inside the arrangement your self-erasure made possible, they will sense this shift before you do. They will feel the difference in the texture of your attention. Not that you are hostile, not that you are withholding, but that the quality of your presence has changed. It has weight now. It has center. It does not pour itself out the way it once did, automatically, reflexively, as though your attention were a liquid that flowed toward the nearest emotional low point. Now your attention stays where you place it. It does not wander toward someone else's crisis unless you direct it there, and this is new, and it is terrifying. Not for you, though it may frighten you too, but for them, because they have lost something they did not even know they had. They have lost the psychic subsidy of your endless emotional availability. They have lost the one who made their unconsciousness possible, and they will grieve it. Though they will not call it grief, they will call it concern, they will call it worry, they will call it love. They will say, I just want the old you back. And what they mean is, I need you to resume your function so that I do not have to feel what I have been avoiding. But you cannot resume, not because you are unwilling, because you are unable. The structure that allowed you to function in that way has been altered at a level that is deeper than decision. You did not choose to stop being the container cracked, and what came through the crack? Your own unlived life, your own unfelt feelings. Your own unspoken needs cannot be put back inside. It is here now. It is real. It is not asking for your permission. It is asking for your acknowledgement, not your analysis, not your understanding, your acknowledgement, the simple, almost primitive act of turning toward what has emerged and saying not with words, not as a déclaration, but as en éternelle orientation. Yes, this is mine, this anger is mine, this grief is mine, this hunger that I spent 30 years converting into service, into empathy, into the endless accommodation of other people's realities, this hunger is mine. And it does not need to be justified. It does not need to be explained. It does not need to be softened or contextualized or made palatable for someone else's comfort. It simply needs to be allowed to exist inside you without being immediately transformed into something useful. This is what Jung meant by integration, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in the entire body of his work. Integration does not mean resolution. It does not mean that the conflicting parts of your psyche reach a harmonious agreement and settle into a peaceful coexistence. It means that you develop the capacity to hold contradiction without collapsing into one side. It means that you can feel your anger and your love simultaneously, not as a confusion, but as a fullness. It means that you can recognize the mother complex operating in real time, feel its gravitational pull, and choose not to follow it, not because you have conquered it, but because you have become large enough to contain it without being consumed by it. The complex does not disappear. The shadow does not vanish. The Father's voice does not go silent. They remain. They are permanent residents of your psychic household, but they are no longer running the household. They are no longer making decisions on your behalf. In the dark, without your knowledge or consent, you are making the decisions now. And the difference between being lived by your complexes and living with your complexes is the difference between captivity and what Jung would call individuation, not as a destination, but as a continuous, ongoing act of becoming conscious of what was previously operating beneath the surface. You will not feel triumphant when this begins to stabilize. That is important to understand, because every narrative you have absorbed, every hero's journey, every transformation arc, every before and after testimony has conditioned you to expect a moment of arrival, a moment where the clouds part and you stand in the full light of your own becoming, healed, whole, radiant with the aftermath of what you have survived. That moment does not come, not because you have failed, but because the kind of change you are undergoing does not produce radiance. It produces gravity. It produces a heaviness in the best sense of the word, a feeling of being planted, of having weight, of occupying your own body and your own life with a density that was not there before. You are not lighter, you are heavier, not burdened, weighted. There is a difference that your body understands even if your language does not yet have the precision to articulate it. The weighted self does not perform. This is one of the first things you will notice, and it will unsettle you. You will find yourself in situations where the old self would have smiled, would have softened, would have offered a bridge to someone else's comfort, and the new self simply does not move in that direction. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of a kind of internal honesty that no longer permits the automatic generation of warmth that is not genuinely felt. You will sit across from someone who is accustomed to receiving your emotional generosity, your immediate understanding, your reflexive reassurance, and you will notice that the generosity does not flow the way it once did. It is still there, it is still available, but it is no longer automatic. It must be chosen, and the act of choosing changes everything about the quality of what is given, because what is given from choice has an entirely different weight than what is given from compulsion. What is given from the ground of a self that is intact does not drain you, it does not leave you hollow, it does not cost you a piece of your own existence. It is given and you remain whole. And that experience, the experience of giving without disappearing, may be entirely new to you. It may feel strange, almost selfish, as though something is wrong because you still feel solid after offering care to another person. You are used to feeling emptied. You are used to the particular kind of exhaustion that follows emotional labor performed from within the complex, and the absence of that exhaustion does not feel like health, it feels like indifference. It feels like you have become someone you do not recognize, but you have not become someone else. You have become yourself, and the distinction is critical because the narrative of transformation suggests that you leave one self behind and step into another. And that is not what is happening here. What is happening is more like an archaeological uncovering, the removal of layers that were never yours, the clearing away of borrowed identities, projected roles, and internalized demands, until what remains is not a new construction but an original surface. The self that was there before the mother complex taught you that your feelings were dangerous. Before the father complex taught you that your existence required justification. Before the relational system taught you that your worth was measured by your willingness to vanish. That self is not pristine. It is not innocent. It carries every scar, every adaptation, every hard-won piece of knowledge that you accumulated during the decades you spent inside the old architecture. But it carries them differently. It carries them as experience rather than identity. The wound is there, but you are not the wound. The pattern is there, but you are not the pattern. The complex is there. It will always be there, activated by certain tones of voice, certaines relationales configurations, certain moments that echo the original dynamics with uncanny precision, but you are not the complex. You are the one who contains the complex, and that containing that act of holding your own psychological material without being overtaken by it is the thing you spent your entire life doing for others. You were always capable of it. You simply never directed it toward yourself. There is a scene that will come to you, perhaps not today, perhaps not for months, but it will come because the psyche moves toward these moments with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time. You will be standing somewhere ordinary, a kitchen, a hallway, a parking lot, the kind of place where nothing significant is supposed to happen, and you will feel something settle. Not resolve, not complete, settle, the way sediment settles at the bottom of water that has been disturbed. You will feel the full weight of your own presence, not as something you have to perform, not as something you have to prove, but as something that simply is. You are here, you are standing inside your own life, your edges are intact, your center is occupied, and the vast, empty space that opened when you stopped carrying everyone else's emotional reality, that space is no longer empty. It is filled with you, not a grandiose you, not a triumphant you, just you, the one who stayed when staying was terrifying, the one who let the old self crack, the one who sat in the rubble and did not reach for the nearest familiar hand. And in that moment, the question of love, the one that has haunted you through every phase of this process, the one that whispered, "What if I am incapable of real love now? What if the price of boundaries is isolation? What if I traded my heart for my sanity?" That question will not be answered. It will simply become irrelevant because you will understand in a way that is not conceptual but bodily that what you called love before was a particular arrangement of need, wound, and accommodation, an arrangement that served the system but consumed the self. And what you are capable of now, this new, weighted, chosen, boundaried thing, is not less than that. It is more. It is love that does not require your disappearance. It is love that can withstand the other person's displeasure without collapsing. It is love that can hold space for someone else's pain without absorbing it into your own tissue. It is love that remains standing. You may find that fewer people are drawn to you now. That is not a failure. The people who were drawn to the old configuration were drawn to your function, not yourself. They were drawn to the boundaryless, endlessly available, emotionally absorbent version of you that made their own unconsciousness possible. And that version is no longer available, not because you have killed it, because it has been integrated into something larger, something that includes the capacity for absorption but is not governed by it, something that can feel without being flooded, something that can connect without being consumed. The people who will be drawn to this version of you, and they will come, though perhaps more slowly, perhaps more quietly, will be drawn not to your function, but to your presence, not to what you can do for them, but to who you are when you are not doing anything for anyone. And that kind of recognition, the kind that sees you as you are, not as the role you perform, may feel unfamiliar. It may feel unearned. It may trigger the old complex one final time, whispering that you do not deserve to be seen without first proving your usefulness. Let it whisper. Let the old voice say what it has always said. You do not need to argue with it. You do not need to defeat it. You only need to notice that it is speaking and then return your attention to where you are. Here, in the body that carried you through the dissolution of everything you thought you were, in the life that is quieter now, but not empty, in the strange, sober clarity that comes after you stop performing your own existence. You are not who you were. You are not yet who you will become. But you are, for the first time, who you actually are. And that is not a conclusion. It is not a peak. It is the ground. The ground was always there, beneath the performance, beneath the accommodation, beneath the decades of carrying what was never yours to carry. You are standing on it now. It does not shine. It does not announce itself. It simply holds you the way you held everyone else quietly, completely, without asking for anything in return. The difference is that this ground does not require your erasure. It requires your weight, all of it, your anger, your grief, your hunger, your refusal, your tenderness, your capacity to walk away, your capacity to stay. It holds all of it, and you do not need to choose which parts of yourself are acceptable. You do not need to curate your own existence for someone else's comfort. You simply need to stand here with the full weight of everything you are and let the ground do what the ground does.